Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Natasha Jhabhaskar. The NDA-2 government had launched its Make in India program in year 2014 to encourage the world to use India as a global production hub. It promised reforms on norms for foreign direct investment, unpredictable tax policies and a difficult regulatory environment. Prime Minister Narendra Modi presented Make in India as the biggest brand to emerge from the country. He said India was adding deregulation to its strengths of democracy, demography and demand, and promised to end retrospective taxation. So what is really the current status of Make in India? Is it time to rethink the Make in India initiative?
The government is planning to revamp its Make in India initiative and will come up with certain policy changes in important sectors to help fasten the process of creating jobs. As reports suggest, at this stage, the government has identified and shortlisted 4 to 5 sectors from current 25 sectors. The focus will be on labour-intensive and high-potential sectors which include leather, textiles and garments, automobile. Government's latest job creation push comes at a time when it is facing severe criticism for failing to create enough jobs as promised during the 2014 election campaign. The government also plans to boost employment through the informal economy. Skills Ministry plans to train the barefoot entrepreneurs mainly from the informal sector. These entrepreneurs include people involved in tailoring shops, kirana stores, roadside vendors as well as businesses engaged in providing sundry services. In 2016, the government had initiated the Startup India campaign, aimed at promoting bank financing for startup ventures, which would boost entrepreneurship and encourage job creation. The Skill India campaign was launched in 2015 to skill youth in order to meet the organizational standards of the industry. The campaign aims to train over 40 crore people in India in different skills by 2022 in a bid to make them employable. The question to ask is, if these initiatives have really worked, and will the latest revamping suggestion of Make in India help the government achieve its twin objectives of job creation and GDP growth?
Right, so will the latest revamping suggestion really help government achieve its twin objectives of job creation as well as GDP growth? India's manufacturing sector contributes just 17% to the GDP as compared to China's 34%, while that in Korea is 29%, 25% in Brazil and 27% in Thailand. India's manufacturing sector continues to struggle, pulling down the country's overall growth. And to tell us more on this, joining me today is Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Professor of Economics from the Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies, JNU, who is also the former Director General of National Institute of Labour Economics Research. Thanks very much, Professor, for joining us on this program. Coming straight to you, Professor Mehrotra, first on what sort of sentiment the Make in India program has really generated since its launch in 2014?
Well, clearly a sentiment was needed to be generated because the economy was in the doldrums in early 2014. And the Make in India, I remember sort of being at the Prime Minister's statement on the 15th of August 2014 when he said, "Come Make in India."
Right.
So, you know, that "Come Make in India" is not quite emphasized. What he was in a sense really emphasizing is that we are looking forward to much more foreign direct investment.
Right.
And to that extent, you know, we've seen a significant increase in FDI happening. We would like to see more FDI happening in manufacturing, but and a lot of the FDI that has come in is in services. But there is no question that compared to the average that we were managing to achieve of about $40 to $45 billion per annum in the preceding 5 to 10 years, we have ramped that up. So to that extent, there's certainly a mood swing, at least as far as foreign investors are concerned. Having said that, there has been very little mood upswing in respect of private investment. So private investment, if anything, has systematically gone down. So that's a real problem in the last 3 years. Systematically, it has gone down.
Now, there are many who claim that by focusing excessively on manufacturing, the government may be actually neglecting the services sector where India has a natural advantage. Will you really agree with that?
Not at all. I mean, look, services already accounts for 60% of GDP. that itself is a distortion. And there is no reason why, you know, services will not continue to grow. What we have neglected, and I want to really drive this point home, is manufacturing. Because as you rightly pointed out, that our share to contribution of manufacturing to GDP in 25 years since our economic reforms began, since our GDP has almost quadrupled in the last 25 years, but the share of manufacturing in GDP has not risen. That means manufacturing has not been the driving force. It has been the services sector. And so many other countries have managed to achieve much more. Now, it's true that, you know, manufacturing share is not going to rise as much as it has risen for these other states, but, you know, other countries, but we have to increase it. And the reason why we have not managed to increase it, because we didn't have an industrial policy. Between 1991 and 2011, I'm sorry to say, we did not have a national manufacturing policy. It's only in 2011 that we got a national manufacturing policy, but the UPA went into policy paralysis after that. So the Make in India was a good thrust, but unfortunately there are too many barriers, as a result of which private investment has not grown, and so there is a problem. I'm not saying that, you know, many things have not been achieved. I could reel off what has been achieved under
so
Make
in
in
a way
India.
you're saying that the FDI, as far as the foreign direct investment is concerned, has gone up. The sentiment more or less is positive towards manufacturing, and since 2014 things have changed for good for the manufacturing, and the fact that we also have a national manufacturing policy. But there are also experts who say that India cannot boost its manufacturing without being part of the global value chain. What sort of steps the government has really taken to promote this particular aspect of manufacturing?
Well, Look East and Act East policy is certainly one move in that direction, and this government in the last 3 years has certainly sort of taken more active focus on East Asian countries and improving our engagement with them. But that's not really the most important thing. I mean, and I can add that, you know, the government is in the process of planning to create a East Coast Economic Corridor, which will run from Chennai all the way to Kolkata, and hopefully that will enhance the global value chain. But, you know, I think we can look at some more concrete things that have been achieved in the last 3 years, and let me point to those. So, for instance, you know, automobile sector has really grown very much in the last 5 to 10 years generally, and, you know, it's sort of really taken off in the last 3 to 4 years. So automobiles account for about 49% of total manufacturing gross value added in our country, and we have become, in the last 10 or 15 years, among the 2 or 3 top manufacturers of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, trucks, buses, all of these kinds of vehicles, which is, and I must sort of emphasize why this is the case. Because this is one sector in which the country was quite strategic and ensured that there is no inverted duty structure. Inverted duty structure means you allow finished goods to be imported relatively cheaply, while intermediate products or capital goods for producing these are more expensive. This wasn't the case in automobiles. So we've done well in automobiles. Secondly, we are beginning to do reasonably well in defense production. You know, we are the largest importer of defense equipment in the world. You know, we cannot afford to remain like that. China transformed itself from being a major importer in the year 2000, and by 2010 it has become an exporter, and we need to move in that direction. And electronics hardware, I think the share of value, the share of total, the total value added of electronics manufacturing in our country has grown. So it was about 100% in 2014. We were importing everything.
And there's a huge consumption market.
That's
in
right.
In fact, as far as the smartphones,
semi knocked down, completely knocked down, manufacturing in the electronics is happening. And the final thing that I think has begun to change is the ease of doing business. So there have been some achievements, so certainly.
In fact, we have seen this in the data also, the fact that India has actually climbed up there in the ease of doing business. But as far as the automobile sector is concerned, it was only yesterday we talked about air pollution. Sort of a paradox here if I talk about promoting the automobile sector. Of course, you know, we are looking at the collateral damage of the automobile sector in the form of air pollution. But joining us on the program now is also the consulting editor of Business Standard, Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee. Thanks very much, Shubhamoy, for joining us Now, what's your assessment? What Make in India has really achieved since 2014?
As Professor Malhotra has pointed out, that we have had more success with drawing in investments from abroad rather than making investments from within the country. But let's look at why manufacturing in India hasn't really picked up. Now, the reason why it has not picked up, and it's not just in last 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, the manufacturing sector in India has been very cocooned right for last few decades. It worked in a situation where there was hardly any competition. Companies were sort of assigned fiefdoms, zamindaris, so to say, to operate there without any fear of competition. It was the classic example of a country shooting itself in the foot. And whereas the ones who faced the competition were the small and medium enterprises. Now, what happened is, once the license system started collapsing, these companies suddenly found they didn't have the ability to compete with anybody, at least even within their own domestic market. Gradually, as any sector got opened up, telecom, electronics, even as sector like motorcycles, we found that there were better competitors who could drive them out of the market, and they did. Essentially, the manufacturing sector's steam had sort of evaporated by the early 90s. And it has not regained it ever after that, excepting in the public sector. In fact, some of the public sector companies like NTPC, even BHEL, power companies largely, aluminum companies, steel companies, SAIL actually came back very vigorously. They managed to make themselves heard. But the companies in the private sector, they gave up the ghost. And so what happens is that these companies, if they want to be, or if we want them to actually get back the mojo to start manufacturing at scale again, we need to make some major changes in the factor market, which is capital, labor and land. Without reform in these three, it is impossible to expect that manufacturing sector would come back.
Now that brings me to my second question, that when we talk about stakeholders in the manufacturing space, how far do you feel that the stakeholders today, post the national manufacturing policy and after also the launch of the Make in India, do they really feel energized? You talked about the role of the labor, the land, and also most importantly capital. Do they really feel energized today?
Well, capital is something that we have talked about enough in this show, so I'll let it off with that. Let's look at land and labor. Land is something that manufacturing needs. Now, it's no point saying who needs how much land, but the point is getting land is so costly. It was difficult, became politically difficult, now it's economically difficult. Every newspaper has been carrying calculations of how much it costs to get a piece of land. So, definitely land is a major constraint, and that is a constraint that isn't going away in a hurry. So, that's one area where if there is a greenfield production unit to come up. Labor laws change is something that the states have to do. The center has begun work on where it can do. It has classified them into 4 codes, the 36 labor laws. It has sort of worked on, Professor Malhotra is the past master authority on labor, and so he will be able to say, but basically the labor sector is something where there's a lot to be talked about, but it's even there the center has only started work, the states hardly are there. Now, unless these things, manufacturing doesn't happen in 1 or 2 year cycle. It has to be a 10-15 year cycle. So, anybody who wants to plan manufacturing would be planning for the year 25 now. He wouldn't be planning for the year 2018. So, unless we have a policy, a plan, and which is showing consistency over the next 15 years, 10 years at least, it's very difficult to expect the domestic manufacturing of the sort which you are talking about, basically greenfield.
So when we're talking about reaping dividends, it is going to take time. It is not really going to happen, in any short-term measure. It is actually a very, very long-term phenomenon. Now, if one looks at the number of factors which are affecting manufacturing, there's of course policy inaction in infrastructure development. Power and fuel shortage remains a challenge. Shubhamoy talked about labor laws, stringent labor laws, barriers in land acquisition, inefficient labor, abundant abundance of unskilled workforce and lack of technology innovation. Now, these have been the few areas, which is widely reported that why, manufacturing hasn't really picked up. Your comments on the fact that we are looking at 25% of making manufacturing 25% of GDP by 2025. Is this really an overambitious target at this stage?
Well, let's aim at it. Let us set an overambitious target. We might get from at least 17% to 20%. I mean, I think Shubhamai rightly pointed out, and you've also emphasized this, that this is a you see, when private investors take decisions to set up plants, especially the larger corporates, they're taking a long-term decision. So therefore, it's critical that government and the corporates are on the same page. Right. Now, there are several things that Shubham has rightly pointed out, and I just want to sort of take them a little further along. Right. One of the reasons why investment generally has not been rising is, as we all know, that there has been a dual balance sheet problem in the economy, with the banks being overextended and their NPA, non-performing assets on the one hand, and then companies with stalled projects having earlier over borrowed, not projects not taking off, they're not making money, consumer demand is not growing, so no one is borrowing. Right. The government has taken 3+ years now finally to come up with a plan for recapitalization of the banks. So, we might begin to see, once the recapitalization happens, some increase in lending in about a year's time. We are in for a long haul, and we should be prepared for that. There is no question about that. Thankfully, we are beginning to see action. Der aaye durust aaye is what is the. Now, on labor, again, Shubhamai very rightly said, the central government alone has about 45 labor laws. The government has been moving, the Ministry of Labor has been moving towards 4 codes. 3 of them are up on the website of the Ministry of Labor. In other words, collapsing them, condensing them. Why is 45 laws a problem? They're a problem because you have to take into account 2 factors. One, you have only about 3,000 labor inspectors in the country. True. If you divide 3,000 by 45, you get about sort of 60 labor inspectors per law. That's a completed non-starter.
Okay, labor laws remain challenging. I'll have to interrupt you here. It's now time for me to take a short break. Next, when we come back, we'll focus more on this issue, the challenges in terms of labor laws. What are the key drivers? What are the key barriers? What needs to be done? The government has set a target of 25%, making manufacturing's share in the GDP by 25%. That means an annual growth rate of 10 to 14%. Also looking for generating around 100 million new manufacturing jobs in the next 15 years. Is that really an achievable target? On the other side, stay tuned. Welcome back. You are watching Insight. Every month, 1 million Indians become age eligible to join the workforce. But the growth in jobs has not kept pace with the rising number of aspirants. The result, unemployment has been on the rise despite India supposedly being one of the brighter spots in a slowing global economy. More than 60% of the 8 lakh engineers graduating from technical institutions across the country every year remain unemployed as per All India Council for Technical Education. Our focus now is on the major drivers and barriers that exist in promoting Make in India. Skill and quality education is at the very core of it. Joining me on the program now is also the Director of Indian Institute of Finance, Professor Aman Agarwal. Thanks very much, Professor, for joining us on this show. You missed the first segment, so let me start asking you the first question. What's your assessment of the Make in India launch since 2014, how it has done?
No, I think the Make in India program has been fairly successful given the limelight it has got internationally and the kind of FDI investments which have been coming into different segments. And we can see the IPP numbers also growing up to about 3.8 to 4.3% in the last 2 months. Not only that the Indian industry is gearing up to it, but there are a large number of foreign companies which are coming forth, and that is also promoting the word India, which had been one of the key factors which we saw in the late 90s and the early 2000s, where a large number of countries were trying to brand themselves.
Right.
And Make in India program helped that try and build up that brand issue. There were certainly certain lacunas when it comes to implementation, and the second part was that it was not having a direct impact which was being thrown on jobs or the GDP growth, which could not be seen.
Right.
And there were multiple factors why we did not see GDP growth take place as it was in the previous year, but because of demonetization and then the GST and a couple of other economic policies. But we are seeing that gradually come up. I think with the new Make in India phase which they're trying to bring forth, they're trying to focus on both jobs and the GDP growth factor, which is very critical. Jobs is not a matter of concern only for India. Worldwide, there has been retrenchment in the last 10 years on an annual basis of almost a monthly basis of about 30 to 40,000 jobs worldwide being lost every month in almost every country around the globe. And India is not an exception to it, but the number was fairly low in the past, given that there were a large number of segments which are going up. Post demonetization and the GST, there has been some restrictions on the MSME segment in terms of recruiting some of them which were in the unofficial market and paying them off. Now those jobs have actually got cut down extensively, and then there have been large number of regulatory prudences which have come in. If you look at one of the factors within these two frameworks is automobile industry. If you look at the automobile, the NGT is now coming out of order in terms of the pollution-free environment, but not understanding the fact that it will hamper the growth of all these industries which the Prime Minister's new policy framework is want to focus on, because all of them are polluting industries. And are we now wanting to curb our growth and look at only pollution and growth in terms of even human capital, because large amount of the growth in GDP factor for the last 15 or 20 years now, after the new economic reform starting in 1991, has shifted from agriculture and manufacturing to services industry.
Right.
As of today, our portfolio of the total GDP growth is about 60% on an average coming to services sector. And that would be majorly impacted with some of these regulators.
How can you actually make your economic growth also energy efficient, in terms of the challenges which we have seen and what we are witnessing also, and it continues to remain a very, very big issue. But in terms of key drivers and barriers, Professor, what in your opinion remains the key drivers for us as far as the manufacturing industry here in India is concerned? What is it that needs to change, and barriers also?
Absolutely. Let me begin with one fallacy or misconception that seems to be prevailing among both journalists as well as policymakers, that we are adding 12 million per annum to the labor force, which means we need to create 1 million jobs per annum.
Okay. I'll quickly take Shubhamoy's opinion on this. Shubhamoy, what's your take on the fact that the key drivers and barriers, which are actually a very, very key component, and what is it that needs to change in the attitude when it comes to promoting the manufacturing industry?
So manufacturing cannot go in sort of isolation. Right. So when you are having environment, when we're having this sort of a manufacturing explosion that we're talking about, let's look at any sector. It cannot be an energy, it cannot be entirely be cut off from, say, pollution or other issues. Those have to be factored in. And those are factored in, there's obviously going to be something which the government has to be aware of. So you cannot say that, Natasha, that that environment or issues or other issues will not play a part in when we talk about manufacturing. So that's one thing very important, that it has to be environmentally sensitive. The second part of it is manufacturing cannot be the driver for employment.
True.
That is not possible in the day when everything is so fine-tuned in terms of the automation characteristics.
True.
So employment has to come from the other sectors.
So employment has to come from the other sectors. In fact, automation remains another big issue. What really will be the future of work? And when we are looking at manufacturing in terms of generating more jobs, can it really do that in the present scenario of work? On the other side, we'll try and analyze this issue further in terms of potential sectors, which sectors can really do well as far as the manufacturing space is concerned. On the other side, stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. India's unemployment rate grew from 6.8% in 2001 to 9.6% in 2011, according to Census 2011 data. More than 30% of the Indians aged between 15 to 29 are neither in employment nor in any training or education. The NDA government focused on giving a boost to skill development and entrepreneurship. One of the biggest challenges of skill development in our country is that 93% of the workforce is in the informal sector. An estimated 2.3% workforce in India has formal skill training, which is much below from that in other developing countries. Our focus now on sectors that need further promotion. And what about entrepreneurship? Are we seeing more startups coming up? Coming back to you, Professor Malhotra, on this, the fact that we are looking at Skill India, Stand Up India, Startup India, and series of initiatives, and we are looking at quality training and skill training, because if you're looking at more jobs in the manufacturing sector, you also need quality training, quality education, and passing on employable skills. Now, how bad or good the scenario is there?
Quite bad. Let me start with the education level of the workforce first of all, before I come to the skill level. You mentioned the 2%, only 2% of our total workforce is actually has formal vocational education or training. But what most people don't recognize is that nearly half of our workforce is either illiterate or has primary or less than primary education. That share is dropping, especially among the youth, because youth are getting educated. But this has been a major the fact that we have 300 million in 2011, we had 300 million illiterate people who were adults illiterate. Was a huge barrier against manufacturing growth of any kind. However, the good news is on the education front that we managed to achieve 97% net enrollment rate at primary level 10 years ago, and as a result of that, there's been upward pressure. So gross enrollment at secondary level, classes 9 and 10, has gone up from what was under 60% in 2010 to 85% in 2015. So in other words, those who are joining the labor force now are going to be more and more educated. So that's good news. So in other words, the potential for our expanding manufacturing is that much greater. And we do have a window of opportunity, Natasha. Unlike what you were saying, we are not adding 12 million persons to the labor force. We are adding only 2.5 million persons to the labor force. And these are the young people who I said are getting educated, they will look for non-agricultural work. So it's absolutely critical that now that they are educated, we skill them properly, because otherwise what will happen is that companies which invest will decide, well, we are getting educated people, but they're not vocationally trained or skilled.
Sort of skill mapping which is required.
No, skill mapping is one thing, Natasha. The problem has been that the government has been sort of cognizant over the last 5 or 10 years about the need for increasing skilling, but they have gone the wrong way in the following sense. You rightly made a point that such a high proportion of our engineers are not employable. Why? Because their skills are very poor. Because the quality of the education that is being imparted is very poor, and this holds true for even the training which is given to the 15 to 18-year-olds. They are being given short-term training. The only institution in vocational education training system in our country which offers long-term training is the Industrial Training Institute, but we don't have enough of them, and the private sector has grown without any regulation in ITIs. The rest, the NSDC's funded institutions, all the other institutions in our country are offering short-term training. That's a huge problem. That leads to a quality problem. So we need to give quality skilling to young people if they are going to be prepared for the manufacturing sector.
Okay, now when we talk about quality training and the right education which is required for people to be getting these jobs in the manufacturing sector, and the fact that the very idea of doing this program today is that there are reports today that the government is thinking of revamping the Make in India initiative for looking at two major objectives of job growth as well as GDP growth. Is it possible, in the present scenario, because there are several drivers which will actually lead to a stronger response in the Make in India, but if these drivers don't work, if Skill India doesn't work, if you don't have quality education, it will fall flat?
No, you are right in a way that these are important changes which are taking place. I think the government is moving towards the right direction. You need to have a focus which needs to be there to work towards it, and then give direction to various segments of the society to work towards it also. In fact, we came out with a study on theory of employment, wealth creation, and creating a national labor exchange, which was presented at the World Bank annual meetings in April and then the ADB meetings, and that has gained acceptability internationally. Various governments are looking at that particular work to introduce a national labor exchange along the lines of the Bombay Stock Exchange, where people can go and list themselves and trade their man hours and so on and so forth, and get appropriate recruitment. I think that could be one option which is there, which has been looked up by various countries, and I think India may want to consider that as well. The other thing which is important is that what are the regulators doing? Regulators are trapped up in the Cadbury scenario. The Cadbury scenario is with corporate social responsibility, they listed out certain parameters, and then it had become a ticking scenario that, oh, if you have achieved these following points, you are doing your corporate social responsibility. Similarly, regulators like even the AICTE has created certain regulatory framework wherein they look at certain basic parameters, and the focus from academics, from teaching, giving inputs, has shifted to infrastructure.
Okay.
Whether you have, and we have been seeing in the last 1 week, if you look at the newspaper, almost every second day there is some institution which is being shut down by AICTE. This non-tunement of regulators with the government's focus is something which is creating a problem. With the NGT also, when you are trying to restrict a car, saying the life of a car is only 10 years or 15 years, you are telling the automobile industry to shut down the operations here in this country, and people not to buy cars anymore in the big cities. What are you telling the people? That you should not start moving, you should look at a job next to your house only, you should not look at a house in a different location because there is a restriction of transportations and so forth, and then this will tend to amount to reduction in production and facilities and creating more vehicles. They are now talking about, newspapers are talking about that you need to have more creative ideas, you need to have facilities. I remember in Japan when they launched hybrid cars, Japanese people were not ready to buy because it was about 1 million yen more than the regular car. The Japanese government came out with a philosophy where they said we will subsidize this for 1 million so that people start buying hybrid cars. Instead of creating facilitating environments, regulators and governments are going in opposite direction. And I think the regulators need to fulfill the requirements of this country and the needs of this country as per the needs of this country.
Okay, there has to be a very multi-pronged approach, and as Professor Agarwal also mentioned that, you know, if one looks at, there are certain parameters, and if you fit on these parameters, you know, even if one looks at education, the focus is more on enrollment than on learning outcomes, so what a student is actually learning in school. Now, the major reason, you know, when we say that why revamping Make in India initiative is important, you're looking at 4 or 5 sectors, you're looking at leather, garment, automobile, engineering. In fact, there was also talk of introducing food processing in this particular arena. Why revamping at this stage is important, and which sectors, in your opinion, Shubhamoy, have a lot of potential which can actually generate jobs to people in the current level of education they have?
Revamping is never a bad idea, because in the last 3 years, and to give credit to the current government, it has been saying, and it has led to a lot of good ideas coming out from for Make in India. So there's definitely been an upswing in terms of the information, in terms of the learning that's been happening around manufacturing sector. Now that's something that is obviously leading to an idea that probably there are areas which can be fine-tuned. Larger number of sectors could be brought in. There are some sectors which are already showing signs that they are already up and moving. So they may not need hand-holding. So that's fair enough, that any policy which is fairly robust needs to do this factor of weeding out sectors which have already sort of, you know, showing that they are stable or they've taken off, and bringing in other sectors which needs to be sorted. Which are the sectors which need to be done? Food processing, as you said, that's essentially the capital intensive sectors know their business to a large extent, and also, as I said, that they are long term gestation periods. You can't do pretty much in terms of changing them overnight. A petrochemicals complex, a defense manufacturing thing, a steel factory, these do not come up overnight. They take time, and the production plans and others are more or less in sync. They are more receptive to what happens on the capital market and land. But the labor intensive sectors, which is where the employment extraction happens, which is food processing, textiles, these are the sectors, light engineering, are areas where the government can actually give sustained support. And that's where what you talked about Skill India becomes so important. See, what had happened is that in our Skill India program, and it's not the failure of the government, it is what happened is that for many years, industry had not thrown up any indication that how many types of people of what sort do they need.
Okay.
When the government in the 1950s set up the IITs, it was clearly aware that it needed metallurgical and civil engineers, and those were the larger number of people who were graduating from those first sets.
Right.
Gradually then as the economy became more progressive, they added electronics, electrical and stuff. Now that's what exactly, that was something that the industry was at the time throwing up. That sort of a mapping hasn't come from manufacturing industry for a long time. Why? Because manufacturing industry in India itself had gone into a sort of a recess, doldrum, whatever you might say. So they had no idea. It's now that the government is actually getting a sense that fine, here's my program of Skill India, apprenticeship, which you and Professor Malhotra talked about, needs to be done. And when it's being done, which are the sectors where the demand would likely to come?
So are we also seeing this greater interaction between the government and the industry today in
Absolutely.
terms of
Now
what is it that they need and what is it that can be actually provided to them?
Absolutely, Natasha. You can now see there's a lot of talk that's happening. There's a lot of discussion that's happening on the ground. Industry has realized that there's oomph in the idea that skill would be coming. The government has the ability to train people, and simultaneously they can then start projecting what sort of people for how many years do they need.
Now, Professor Malhotra, what sort of ecosystem is required? Because this has been a big complaint all this while, that the sort of interaction which must exist between the academia, research, industry, do we need to really rework in terms of working our manufacturing ecosystem where there's a greater, so that companies won't say that we first have to untrain you and then take you into our organization?
There is certainly an increase in the interaction between industry and government in recent years in respect of skilling, but I don't believe that it has gone to a scale or is of the quality that is required if we are going to become a manufacturing nation, and we have to become a manufacturing nation. Manufacturing has to become a lead sector. So what am I saying? I'm saying that in countries which have successful skill development ecosystems, it's industry which is leading the skill development effort. It's industry driven and it is demand driven. It is not supply driven as it is in our country. It's unfortunately in our country, our skill ecosystem is government financed and government driven, which inevitably leads to a supply driven system, and I think Shubhamay was hinting at that. Unfortunately, industry has not really come on board and recognize that they have to do the skilling, and they need to not just articulate their demand so that government comes in with its own taxpayer money and sort of fulfills it, because ultimately who's going to benefit from this industry? So industry has to begin to put its money where its mouth is. In other words, it needs to be training people, and 62 other countries of the world which have successful skill ecosystems are those countries where the system is industry driven, demand driven, and industry financed. But this is only one major driver, and I want to talk about two other drivers of manufacturing in our country. The potential sectors have been mentioned by Shubhamay as well as you. I want to emphasize the following, that there are 5 labor intensive manufacturing sectors in our manufacturing sector which must receive packages. Only one of them has received a package, which is garments. What we need is a package for food processing, for leather and footwear, and we need it for wood and furniture. That's a third sector which is labor intensive, and textiles also needs a package. So what am I saying? These 5 sectors account for 50% of all manufacturing employment. And therefore, the government needs to seriously come up with a package. I am hearing that food processing and leather might be under preparation. But there is one other driver which I don't think anyone of us has spoken about, and unfortunately the government is seriously not thinking about these. Please try and appreciate that most of the manufacturing in our country happens in geographic clusters.
Clusters.
There are about 6,000 clusters across the country. However, our MSME ministry, the Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises Ministry, has a very weak program, poorly designed and poorly funded for cluster development. There are at least 1,350 of those 5,000 to 6,000 clusters which are modern industry clusters, and those need packages, and there is a combination there is a combination of unorganized sector and organized sector enterprises in these manufacturing geographic clusters.
Okay.
And the government has to become much more serious about this. And my last point, Natasha, if I may, which is about land, which Shubhamai rightly pointed out, that if manufacturing is to grow in our country, more land will be needed. However, how is land going to be suddenly created? The only way the land is going to become available is if people are leaving agriculture. In other words, there are fewer farmers on our fields.
So what happens to food security then?
No, that's not a problem. We just need to increase productivity. We have to ensure investment in agriculture. And there are many things that need to be done to encourage labor-intensive manufacturing, some of which we've been talking about, which will ensure these workers move out, and construction work has to, will absorb them. Infrastructure investment in rural and urban areas.
This is repeatedly said by the government, also creating more opportunities for people who will move out of
but that was
agriculture.
happening between 2004, 5 and 11, 12. Unfortunately, in the last 4 or 5 years, construction job growth has dramatically fallen.
So reviving manufacturing will actually it actually needs a lot of steps, be it the regulatory environment, also in terms of the quality of MSME clusters, development also in terms of how we are actually enriching the demographic dividend of this country, in terms of investing in quality education and health, and change in labor laws. Technology remains a very, very key component. Innovation is at the very core of Make in India. So in the present competitive scenario, how far innovation is being seen as a key driver. We'll focus on that also on the other side in our final segment. What's really is the way forward? Welcome back. You're watching Insight. Are we really ready to tackle the threat of automation and artificial intelligence? So with machines fast replacing men, there's a paradigm shift which needs urgent attention. In economics, one often comes across the concept of employment elasticity. This concept refers to the rate of jobs growth in relation to the GDP growth. And according to a recent HDFC Bank report, employment elasticity in the economy is currently close to zero. In other words, for every 1 point rise in GDP, jobs actually grew only 0.15%. Finally, what really is the way forward? Coming straight to you, Professor Agarwal, what really is the way forward in terms of the challenges that we face, the threat of automation, artificial intelligence, and simultaneously, are we really investing in innovation? Because that remains a key component.
I think you pointed out very well. I think the government is fairly clear on what they're looking at. The objective in the Make in India program, recentering it and reorienting it as well, is a clear indication to that. Policy framework, fortunately, is fairly good. Various policies have been framed in the past. But when we are lacking is, firstly, is the implementation. When it comes to implementation, there is not smooth implementation of some of these policies. We are not able to see results at the end of the day. The other problem, which is with the people at the ground, as well as government is now facing the heat in terms of implementing, is corruption, which is creating this backlog. Now, if we are able to try and reduce, we cannot finish them up, but at least if we are able to try and reduce some of these, and the smooth functioning of some of these bodies, any regulatory. You see, when I read these news items every day that one institution or the second institution has been shut down by ICT, please imagine hundreds of professors and staff members are going to be thrown out. One side we're talking about creating jobs, other side we're trying to retrench people off. You need to, if there is some lacuna, you need to tell them what the lacuna is and ask them, give them a period to update themselves. AICT moved it into its own building after almost about 25-30 years of its existence, and they expect an educational institution to set up a full facility structure to be day one. Now, I think the government needs to have, and I fortunately was invited by representing the industry, addressing the Parliamentary Committee on Education almost about 15 years back, where I told about the same scenario. I think we need to give that breathing space. If there is not proper environment, how will a plant grow? You cannot grow the plant in just an isolation with beautiful manure or seed. It needs that environment, that oxygen to breathe through. And I think the government is trying to foster that, but various agencies. Look at the banking scenario. Large amount of MSME segment is suffering on account of the fact that large amount of funds are not being given to them. They are being kept with the RBI as fund, and they are not being given to the industry. Education itself, large number of students are wanting to take education loans, but they are not being given to them. Now, when they are not being flushed with some of these facilities, how do you expect them to perform and take the word India forward tomorrow, benefiting the people in the country as well as the government and creating its market value, which is fairly high internationally as of today.
Shubhama, do we really have a very compartmentalized sort of an approach when we make a policy? We don't really understand that each policies are actually, linked to the another one. So there has to be greater convergence. We talk about inter and intra, convergence of ministries, greater interactions within, and because this has been a big issue when we talk about any such policy. There are multiple agencies involved, and you can't really address the challenge if you have everyone working in their own direction. Is that a big challenge in terms of, when we talk about, what really is the way forward for the manufacturing sector from here?
Natasha, I think you've made a very major point. And I think that is the problem. In India, the one ministry which is actually acting against Make in India is the Commerce Ministry. Commerce Ministry mandarins love talking at WTO.
Right.
Nobody wants to work on a bilateral FTA or a bilateral just simple negotiation to open up more export market for SMEs. You hardly find those on the table. Similarly, a bureaucrat, if he is posted to the Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises, that's considered the akin of being sent out.
Right.
People want to be posted to ministries which are, the grand policy making ones.
Right.
The ministries which are actually the hand and feeder ones, actually, which is what you're talking about, the steel sector. He talked about education. The sectors like steel, labor, textiles, MSME, these sectors, these ministries, commerce, an economic sectors bureaucrat would hate being posted there. Anybody who is ambitious. Now, what does it show? That it is great to write a policy. It is hell if that policy has to be implemented. No bureaucrat wants to do it, and I think that is the biggest challenge for Make in India. We frankly need far fewer ministries doing far less work if the manufacturing sector or any sector needs to go up. The services sector went up because there was no Ministry of Services.
True.
The reason why the manufacturing sector got into problem initially, as we talked about, and later on now, is because there's so many ministries.
Okay, because there's so many ministries. Final word on the program, last 5 minutes on the show. Professor, automation remains a challenge. What sort of future of work are we really looking at?
I believe that the fears that are being expressed about automation are exaggerated. This is a bogey. Let me explain what I mean. This is going to impact only the top end of capital intensive organized sector manufacturing, because you cannot on the one hand say that, oh, our industry, especially the top end, the organized capital intensive, doesn't create much jobs, and then you say, oh, suddenly Industry 4.0 is going to come and is going to destroy jobs. The fact of the matter is that Industry 4.0 is likely to both create jobs on the one hand as well as destroy jobs. In any case, so this is my first point. My second point is, I'll take you back to what you were asking in the previous segment, which is to what are the drivers that we can ensure that we in India also become a major innovator. Let us remind ourselves that there are only 5 countries in the world which are driving most of the research and the innovation, commercialization meaning, in the space of Industry 4.0. And those countries are 3 from Asia, Japan, Korea and China, 1 from Europe, that's Germany, and then the United States. India practically is not there. What is the reason for that? One of the main important reasons is that we spend only 0.8% of GDP on research and development, on R&D.
Right.
And a very significant proportion of that comes from the government and not from the private sector. So the private sector has to increase its own investment into R&D, otherwise forget about innovation happening. My other point is that, we were in the earlier section, we were talking about the environmental impact of industrialization. I think we should certainly worry about that.
Okay.
I said earlier that automobiles account for about 49% of our total gross value added in manufacturing. However, why do we have a policy which is encouraging four-wheeler production, meaning car production, whether it is petrol and diesel, as opposed to bus production? We need much more buses production so that the cost of
Public
buses,
transport you're referring.
public transport becomes cheaper, meaning buses become cheaper, so our municipalities are able to buy them. I mean, Delhi has not bought buses, I understand, any buses in the last 5 or 6 years. This is a completely unacceptable situation in a city where we have 8 million plus automobiles. So yes, the idea is good that the government is encouraging e-vehicles. We are thinking about that, but someone has to do the research in that regard as well. And why are we not sort of perhaps thinking first about enhancing the production capacity for buses as opposed to private vehicles?
Even for e-vehicles, the cost factor remains a big issue, because it is in fact a very, very costly affair to buy an e-vehicle. And in fact, they have set certain targets. Again, how many industries will really come forward to manufacture these e-vehicles? Completely out of time. Thanks very much. But as of now, the basic understanding is that the private investment has to go up, and also we are looking at the private players, even in terms of imparting the right skills, will have to play a bigger role when we talk about the manufacturing sector. And if you're looking at a target of making the share of manufacturing 25% by 2025. Thanks very much, all of you, for joining us on this program. And that's all we have for you in our this edition of Insight. Thanks very much for watching.